What does it mean to be American? What defines us as a country? Is it our fried food? Maybe it's the football most obsess over. What about our ever-prominent music industry? Or does the definition fall into a political spectrum? Does our freedom define our country? What about one of the amendments? Freedom of speech, perhaps? Throughout my life and everything I've learned in school, one thing has always stuck out to me regarding America's past. People use their voices to change circumstances. This is called dissent. Dissent is what happens when a group realize they are being treated unfairly and band together to fight injustice. America has been shaped by this tradition. It can be traced back to the beginning of our country. In the Revolutionary War, dissent was one of the very things that initiated it. Colonists feared the outsiders they were supposed to house, were ignored by the King of England and Parliament, and had to pay for a war they didn't have a part in. The people rose up. The colonists formed groups to organize protest and to keep the people throughout colonies informed of events that were occurring. Groups like the Sons of Liberty and Daughters of Liberty organized boycotts or made clothing or other products in the colonies so the colonists wouldn't have to buy them from British merchants. If it hadn't been for the colonists' protests and dissent, we wouldn't have the America we do today. We would probably still be under control of Britain. At the least, we wouldn't have our freedom of speech, even the right to vote for a president.
There's been time after time when this was the case, when principled dissent was seen as radical, if not indeed unpatriotic, but it turned out over a period of years to be a way to advance the country, to make us a more perfect union. It's very American. It's deep in our id to want to keep improving the country. And we can't continue to improve the country when we listen to the voice of leaders who say, listen, we want to return to yesterday.
It's easy to see even outside of wars. Taking a look at the 1950s on civil rights movement, we can see how important dissent is. This is a wonderful example of the way speaking out against injustice has shaped our country. People like Rosa Parks stood their own. She refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white male. In the end, she was arrested, but these actions inspired others. One of the first major protests that resulted in change was the bus boycott led by Martin Luther King Jr., which was inspired by Rosa Parks' actions. It was actually the next day, December 1st, 1955, when he suggested a boycott in the city against racist segregation, specifically on public transport. People of color stopped using buses and would walk or get rides. This boycott went on for 381 days and ended up being very effective. In June 1956, a court ruled that laws enforcing segregated buses were unconstitutional, and the U.S. Supreme Court eventually agreed. If we look at any point in time, we would find dissent shaped women's rights. Many women's rights protests have taken place throughout the years, but the fight for the right to vote is one distinguished circumstance of dissent.
I like to use the instance of women's right to vote. You know, when women started talking about this in the 19th century, they were dissenting, saying, listen, women should have the right to vote. They were castigated very widely. They were sometimes called unpatriotic, but that dissent eventually resulted, it wasn't until the first fifth of the 20th century, but it eventually resulted in women getting the vote.
Moving into today, there's millions of things to look at that include dissent. One large and ongoing issue is the football players' action of kneeling. Colin Kaepernick was one of the first football players to kneel in 2016, and many followed, but this movement did not gain traction right away.
Ultimately, it's to bring awareness and make people, realize what's really going on in this country. There are a lot of things that are going on that are unjust, people aren't being held accountable for, and that's something that needs to change. This country stands for freedom, liberty, justice for all, and it's not happening for all right now. There's people being murdered unjustly and not being held accountable. Cops are getting paid leave for killing people. That's not right. That's not right by anyone's standards.
Police brutality was a key reasoning in these signs of protest. Many innocent people of color died or were injured, and many police officers did not face jail time. It has been an ongoing issue, but this is one of the larger protests in the rights argument. Many people, including our president, Mr. Trump, believe that kneeling is disrespectful to American servicewomen and men and the flag, although the football players that kneel say that that is not their intent. The argument has risen. Is football the place to bring in politics? Whether or not if one agrees with the kneeling and what it symbolizes, I believe Kaepernick and the many other players that speak against this are representing exactly what America is. The ability to speak for what you believe and stand against what seems wrong, and using your platform to send this message.
Football players want to kneel. They are in the tradition of people exercising First Amendment rights.
Another thing that shows dissent and is incredibly powerful is the protest against violence in our schools, specifically the teenagers who have stood up for something that directly affects them. School shootings have been happening for years now, but as gun control becomes more and more of a current issue, increased school shootings have begun to consume us every time they happen. After one of the many in 2018, students of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School have taken the limited amount of change into their own hands.
We are going to be the kids that you read about in textbooks, not because we are going to be another statistic about mass shootings in America, but because, just as David said, we are going to be the last mass shooting. The people in the government who are voted into power are lying to us, and us kids seem to be the only ones who notice and are prepared to call BS. They say that no laws could have been able to prevent the hundreds of senseless tragedies that have occurred. We call BS! That us kids don't know what we're talking about, that we're too young to understand how the government works. We call BS!
In a country where gun control is an issue not many can agree on and not much has been done about in the light of shootings, students take matters into their own hands. Students of Parkland met with Trump to discuss their thoughts on this epidemic that directly affects them. The March for Our Lives event was organized by students. Even a nationwide school walkout after the Parkland shooting was organized and acted on by students. There can be nothing more American than students using their own voices to create something in hopes of making a change in their world. So, what does it really mean to be an American? Who are we as American citizens? What does it mean to live in this country? At the birth of our freedom, we dissented. We rose up and we fought an injustice. Dissent has inspired many monumental and necessary changes in this country. People saw something that was wrong, something unconstitutional, and they dissented in the hopes to change it. Without this mindset or these actions, we would never be where we are today. Dissent is the base and structure of truly being an American.
What is your view in general on the role of dissent in society?
I am for dissent because as I look back over the 190-year history of this country, as I'm sure you have as a student at Ann Arbor, I find that dissent is the great instrument of change. It's the instrument of progress. And that's what really distinguishes a free society from the totalitarian societies. We change those things by reason of the dissent that are wrong. We aren't frozen into them.